Officer Frank Miller was tired after his long shift. The small town of Mapleton was quiet as the sun began to set. Frank had been a police officer for 15 years, and most days were the same. He loved his job, but sometimes he wished for something different to happen. He sat in his patrol car at the edge of town, watching the empty road. The summer heat was finally cooling down as evening approached. Frank rolled down his window to feel the fresh air on his face. He thought about going home soon, making a simple dinner, and watching some TV before bed. The radio played softly, in his car. A country song about lost love and open roads. Frank hummed along, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. He checked his watch. Only 30 more minutes until his shift ended. Just then, a black SUV zoomed past him. The radar gun on his dashboard showed the vehicle was going 68 miles per hour. The speed limit on this road was only 55. Frank sighed. He would have to make one last stop before going home. He turned on his police lights and pulled out onto the road. The SUV slowed down right away and moved to the side of the road. At least the driver was being cooperative. Some people tried to run or argued about their speed. Those stops always took longer. Frank called in the license plate number to the police station. This was standard procedure for all traffic stops. Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. I'm stopping a black SUV on Highway 16 just past the old mill. License plate number RGX 729. Copy that, Officer Miller, came the reply from his radio. Proceeding with your stop. Frank stepped out of his patrol car. He adjusted his uniform and made sure his badge was visible. He also checked that his body camera was on. Safety first, he always said. The SUV was expensive and very clean. Even though the country roads were dusty, this car looked like it had just been washed. The windows were tinted dark, which made it hard for Frank to see inside. He approached carefully, staying alert like he was trained to do. When he reached the driver's window, it rolled down smoothly. A man in his 40s sat behind the wheel. He wore a nice suit and had a friendly smile. Without being asked, the man handed over his license and registration. Good evening, officer, the man said in a calm voice. I apologize for driving too fast. I'm running late for an important meeting. Frank took the documents and looked at them carefully. The driver's license showed the name Richard Grayson. The address said he lived in the city about 50 miles away. The registration matched the SUV and was current. Do you know how fast you were going, Mr. Grayson? Frank asked. He always started traffic stops the same way. I believe I was over the speed limit, Richard admitted. Probably around 65 or 70. I know that's no excuse, but I'm in a hurry to get to Mapleton Memorial Hospital. Frank nodded. The hospital was about 5 miles ahead. Many people drove fast when they were heading to the hospital, but usually they looked more worried than this man did. Is everything okay? Is someone hurt? Frank asked. He was always willing to help in a real emergency. No immediate emergency, Richard said. But we do need to get there soon. That's when Frank noticed the word we. He glanced into the car, more carefully. There was someone sitting in the back seat. Frank shifted his position slightly to see better. This was something all police officers did during traffic stops, just to make sure there were no threats. What Frank saw made him freeze. His face turned pale and he felt his heart beat faster. Sitting in the back seat was a woman he recognized instantly. He had seen her face many times on TV and in newspapers. It was Catherine Powell, the Secretary of State of the United States. Frank couldn't believe his eyes. The Secretary of State was here in his small town in the back seat of this SUV he had just pulled over for speeding. He tried to keep a professional face, but he felt shocked. Is everything all right, officer? Richard asked, noticing how Frank's expression had changed. Frank's hand moved closer to his gun, a reflex from his training. Important government officials usually traveled with security. Was this some kind of security threat? But then he looked again and saw the woman smiling politely at him. Ma'am, Frank said, his voice slightly shaky. I wasn't told that you would be visiting our town. He stood up straighter, feeling suddenly very aware of his dusty uniform and the small coffee stain on his sleeve. The woman in the back seat leaned forward so Frank could see her better. She looked tired but managed a warm smile. That's because this isn't an official visit, Officer Miller, Frank supplied quickly. Officer Frank Miller, ma'am. Officer Miller, she continued. I'm here on personal business. Richard is my brother. He's taking me to see our mother. She's in Mapleton Memorial Hospital, and we were hoping to avoid any attention. Frank nodded slowly, trying to process this information. He knew he should probably call his chief right away. Having such an important person in town was a big deal. There should be proper security and escorts, but he could see the concern in her eyes. This wasn't about politics or official business. This was personal. Your mother is at Mapleton Memorial? Frank asked, his professional manner returning. Yes, Richard replied. Margaret Grayson. She had a stroke yesterday. Frank felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. Margaret Grayson, he knew that name very well. Mrs. Grayson. Margaret Grayson, who taught 3rd grade at Mapleton Elementary for 30 years? Frank asked, his voice now filled with concern. Both. Richard and the secretary looked surprised. Yes, that's our mother, Richard said. Did you know her? Frank nodded, memories flooding back to him. She was my teacher when I was a kid. She was the best teacher I ever had. The secretary smiled. A real smile this time. Not the polite one she had offered before. Mom always loved her students. She still talks about them, even the ones from decades ago. Frank remembered Mrs. Grayson clearly. She had been strict but kind. When other teachers gave up on troubled kids, she never did. Frank had been one of those troubled kids. His father had left when he was 8, and his mother had to work 2 jobs. He had been angry and difficult in class, but Mrs. Grayson had seen something in him. She had stayed after school to help him with reading. She had called his mother to say good things, not just complain. Once she had even come to his Little League baseball game when his mother couldn't make it. I had no idea she was sick, Frankie said, genuine concern in his voice. How is she doing? It was sudden, Richard explained. The doctors say she's stable, but these first few days are critical. We came as soon as we could. Frank looked at the SUV and then back at the road. He made a quick decision. Helping Mrs. Grayson's family was more important than writing a speeding ticket. Listen, Frank said, handing the license and registration back to Richard. I know the quickest way to the hospital that avoids the main streets. If you follow me, I can get you there without anyone noticing. The last thing Mrs. Grayson needs is reporters and cameras while she's recovering. The relief on both their faces was immediate. That would be very helpful, Officer Miller, the secretary said. Mom would hate all the fuss if people knew I was here. Frank nodded and stepped back. Follow me closely. And don't worry about the speeding ticket. Just drive safely from now on. As Frank walked back to his patrol car, his mind was racing. He couldn't believe that Mrs. Grayson, the teacher who had changed his life, was now lying in a hospital bed. And he couldn't believe that her daughter was the Secretary of State. The world felt very small suddenly. Frank got into his car and radioed dispatch. This is Officer Miller. I'm going to escort a vehicle to Mapleton Memorial Hospital. Just helping some out-of-towners find their way. Copy that, Officer Miller, came the reply. Everything okay with the traffic stop? Frank looked in his rearview mirror at the black SUV. Behind those tinted windows was a woman who helped run the country, and a man worried about his mother. But mostly, there were just people who needed to get to the hospital to see someone they loved. Everything is fine, Frank said into his radio. Just fine. I'll be back on patrol after I help these folks. He turned on his lights but not his siren. Then he pulled in front of the SUV and began to lead the way to the hospital, taking the back roads he knew so well. Frank felt a strange mix of emotions, worry for Mrs. Grayson, pride that he could help her family, and a feeling that sometimes life brings surprising connections when you least expect them. Frank led the black SUV through the quiet back roads of Mapleton. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. He had grown up here, patrolled here for 15 years, and never imagined he would be escorting the Secretary of State through his small town. The evening sky turned darker as they drove. Streetlights began to come on, casting pools of yellow light on the empty roads. Frank chose a route that avoided the busy main street, where people might notice the important visitor. The last thing Mrs. Grayson needed was reporters and cameras, crowding the hospital. Frank's radio crackled. "Officer Miller, what's your 20? Your shift ended 10 minutes ago." It was Sergeant Pete, his supervisor. Frank picked up the radio. "I'm escorting some visitors to the hospital. Should be done soon." "Anything I should know about?" Sergeant Pete asked. Frank hesitated. He had not told anyone who was in the SUV. He decided to keep it that way for now. "Just helping some folks who got lost. I'll fill you in tomorrow." "Copy that. Have a good night, Miller." Frank put the radio down and checked his mirror. The black SUV was following closely behind him. Through the windshield, he could see Richard. Grayson focused on the road. Frank wondered what it must be like to have the Secretary of State as a sister. He wondered what Mrs. Grayson thought about her daughter's important job. They were now only a few blocks from the hospital. Frank decided to take them to the side entrance. It was less busy than the main doors, and they could enter without many people seeing them. He turned down a narrow street that ran alongside the hospital grounds. When they reached the side entrance, Frank parked his patrol car and got out. The SUV stopped behind him, and both doors opened. Richard stepped out first, then walked around to help his sister. The secretary looked different in person than she did on TV. She seemed more tired, more human. She wore simple clothes, not the fancy suits Frank had seen her wear during news conferences. "Thank you, Officer Miller," Richard said, shaking Frank's hand. "This means a lot to us." The secretary nodded in agreement. "We appreciate your help and your discretion." Frank felt a little nervous talking to such an important person, but he reminded himself that right now she was just a daughter worried about her mother. "I'd like to help more if I can. Mrs. Grayson was special to me." The secretary looked at him with interest. "You mentioned she was your teacher?" Frank nodded. "Third grade about 23 years ago. But she was more than just a teacher to me." He paused, not sure if he should share his personal story with them. But something made him continue. "My dad left when I was 8. My mom had to work all the time. I was angry and getting into trouble." Richard and the secretary listened quietly as Frank spoke. "Mrs. Grayson noticed I was struggling. She stayed after school to help me with reading. She called my mom with good news, not just complaints. She even came to my baseball games when my mom had to work." Frank smiled at the memory. "She's the reason I became a police officer instead of ending up on the wrong side of the law." The secretary's eyes softened. "That sounds like our mother. She always saw the potential in people." Richard checked his watch. "We should go in. Visiting hours will end soon." Frank stepped forward. "Let me help you. I know some of the staff. Here." He led them to the side door and used his police ID to gain entry. The hospital was quiet at this hour. A few nurses moved between rooms and the smell of disinfectant filled the air. At the nurses' station, Frank saw a familiar face. Nurse Ellen Brown had been working at Mapleton Memorial for as long as Frank could remember. She was in her 60s now, but still moved with energy and purpose. "Frank Miller," she said with a smile. "What brings you here? Are you hurt?" "No, Ellen. I'm fine. These people are here to see Margaret Grayson. She was brought in yesterday after a stroke." Ellen's eyes widened when she recognized the secretary. To her credit, she stayed professional and didn't make a fuss. "Mrs. Grayson is in room 215. She's stable, but visitors are limited to family only right now." "Thank you," Richard said. "We're her children," Ellen nodded. "The doctor just finished checking on her. You can go right in." The secretary turned to Frank. "Will you come with us, Officer Miller? I think Mom would like to see you." Frank was surprised by the invitation. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on a family moment." "You're important to her," Richard said, "and after what you've told us, I think she'd want to see you." Frank followed them to the elevator. His heart beat faster as they rode up to the second floor. He hadn't seen Mrs. Grayson in several years. The last time was at the grocery store, where they had talked briefly about the weather and town news. He regretted not staying in touch more. Room 215 had a small sign with Grayson M. written on it. Richard knocked gently before opening the door. The room was dimly lit, with a single bed near the window. Medical equipment beeped softly, monitoring vital signs, and there she was. Margaret Grayson looked smaller than Frank remembered. Her white hair spread across the pillow and her face seemed pale against the hospital sheets. But when she opened her eyes and saw her children, her whole face lit up. "My dears," she said, her voice weak but clear. "You came." The secretary rushed to her mother's side, taking her hand gently. "Of course we came, Mom. How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here," Mrs. Grayson said. She looked at Richard with a smile. "Both of you?" Richard bent down to kiss his mother's forehead. "You gave us quite a scare, Mom." "Nonsense," Mrs. Grayson said. "It takes more than a little stroke to keep me down." Frank stood awkwardly by the door, not wanting to interrupt. But Mrs. Grayson's sharp eyes spotted him. "Is that Frank Miller I see hiding by the door?" she asked, squinting in his direction. Frank stepped forward, feeling like he was 9 years old again, standing in front of her desk. "Hello, Mrs. Grayson." Her smile grew even wider. "Frank Miller, my star pupil. Come closer and let me look at you." Frank moved to the side of the bed opposite the secretary. "I'm not sure about star pupil. I gave you plenty of trouble." Mrs. Grayson laughed softly. "The troublemakers were always my favorites. Look at you now, in that uniform. I knew you'd do good things." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I wouldn't be wearing this uniform if it wasn't for you, Mrs. Grayson." She reached out her free hand, and Frank took it gently. Her skin felt paper-thin, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You did the work, Frank. I just pointed you in the right direction." The secretary watched this exchange with interest. "Officer Miller was the one who pulled us over for speeding, Mom. Then, he escorted us here through the back roads." Mrs. Grayson's eyes twinkled. "Richard, were you speeding again? Some things never change." Richard looked embarrassed. "Just a little, Mom. We were worried about you." Mrs. Grayson turned back to Frank. "Thank you for helping my children, Frank. Catherine's visits home are complicated these days." Frank nodded, still amazed that his third-grade teacher was mother to the Secretary of State. "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Grayson. Mapleton PD at your service." A nurse came in to check Mrs. Grayson's vitals. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are ending soon. Mrs. Grayson needs her rest." The secretary, Catherine, nodded. "We'll go soon, just a few more minutes." When the nurse left, Mrs. Grayson looked at her children and then at Frank. "Frank, would you do me a favor? Would you show Catherine and Richard where to get some decent food around here? The hospital cafeteria is terrible and they've been traveling all day." Frank smiled. Even from a hospital bed, Mrs. Grayson was taking care of everyone. "There's a good diner just a block away, best pie in town." "Perfect," Mrs. Grayson said. "You three go get some food. I need to rest anyway. You can come back tomorrow." Catherine seemed reluctant to leave. "Are you sure, Mom? We can stay." "I'm sure," Mrs. Grayson said firmly. "Go. Eat. I'll be right here in the morning." After saying their goodbyes, Frank led the secretary and Richard out of the hospital. The night air felt cool after the warm hospital room. Stars were visible in the clear sky above Mapleton. "There's a back entrance to the diner," Frank said. "We can go in without anyone noticing you, ma'am." Catherine smiled at him. "Please call me Catherine. Anyone who means so much to my mother doesn't need to call me ma'am." Frank nodded, still feeling strange about being on a first-name basis with the Secretary of State. "The diner makes great comfort food. I think we all could use some of that tonight." As they walked toward the diner, Frank realized his ordinary day had turned into something extraordinary, and it all started with a routine traffic stop. The back door of Dottie's diner was hardly used by anyone except delivery people and staff. Frank knocked 3 times, and soon the door opened. Dottie herself stood there, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, flour dusting her apron. "Frank Miller, what are you doing at my back door?" Dottie asked, hands on her hips. Then she noticed the 2 people standing behind him. Her eyes widened when she recognized Catherine. "Evening, Dottie," Frank said quickly. "These folks need a quiet meal without any fuss. Can we use your back booth?" Dottie nodded, understanding right away. Of course. Come in, come in. She ushered them inside, through the kitchen where two cooks looked up from their work, but quickly returned to flipping burgers when Dottie gave them a stern look. The back booth of the diner was in a corner, partly hidden by a fake plant. It offered privacy while still giving a view of the whole restaurant. The diner was mostly empty at this hour, just a couple of truck drivers at the counter and an elderly couple by the window. Nobody will bother you here, Dottie promised as she handed them menus. I'll take your order myself. Frank sat across from Catherine and Richard. It felt strange to be having dinner with such important people. Just hours ago, he had been doing a routine traffic stop. Now he was sitting in a booth with the Secretary of State, talking about her mother who had been his teacher. Thank you for all this, Richard said, looking at the menu, for helping us at the hospital and bringing us here. Frank shrugged. It's no problem. Mrs. Grayson is special to a lot of people in this town. Catherine studied Frank with interest. She talked about you, you know. When I was visiting her last Christmas, she showed me a newspaper clipping about you. It was about how you saved that child from the river 2 years ago. Frank felt his face grow warm. He remembered that day clearly. A 5-year-old boy had fallen into the river during the spring floods. Frank had jumped in without thinking and pulled him out. The local paper had called him a hero, but Frank never felt comfortable with that word. Just doing my job, he said, quietly. Mom kept that article in her special box, Catherine continued, the one where she keeps all the important memories. This surprised Frank. He had no idea Mrs. Grayson had saved that article. It made him feel good to know she was still proud of him after all these years. Dottie came back to take their orders. What'll it be? What's good here? Richard asked. Everything, Frank said with a smile. But the meatloaf is famous across 3 counties. They all ordered the meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Dottie promised to bring it quickly and left them alone. Again. So, Frank said, trying to make conversation, how long are you planning to stay in Mapleton? As long as Mom needs us, Catherine answered. I've cleared my schedule for the next week. Richard has to go back to work in a few days. Richard nodded. I wish I could stay longer, but I have an important case coming up. I'm a lawyer, he explained to Frank. Frank wasn't surprised. The Grayson children had clearly done well for themselves. One was Secretary of State, and the other was a lawyer. Mrs. Grayson must be very proud, and you've been a police officer. All this time? Catherine asked. Yes, ma'am. I mean, Catherine, Frank corrected himself. 15 years with Mapleton PD. Never wanted to do anything else. Mom said you were always interested in solving problems and helping people, Catherine said. Even as a child. Frank smiled at the memory. Mrs. Grayson let me be the class helper. I got to clean the erasers and hand out papers. It was the first time anyone trusted me with responsibility. Their food arrived, steaming hot and smelling. Delicious. Dottie had given them extra large portions and added a basket of her famous cornbread. On the house, she said with a wink before leaving them to eat. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The meatloaf was as good as Frank had promised. Outside, the small town of Mapleton was settling in for the night. Streetlights glowed softly and the occasional car drove past the diner windows. So what happens now? Frank asked after a while. With Mrs. Grayson, I mean. Richard wiped his mouth with a napkin. The doctors say she needs to stay in the hospital for a few more days. Then she'll need care at home for a while. We're worried about her living alone after this, Catherine added. But she's so independent she won't want to leave her house. Frank understood their concern. Mrs. Grayson had lived in the same house on Maple Street for as long as anyone could. Remember, it was a small white house with blue shutters and a garden full of flowers in the summer. Has she ever considered moving to a retirement community? Frank asked. There's a nice one just outside town, Cedar Grove. Some of my mom's friends live there. Catherine sighed. We've suggested it before. She always says she's not ready for that yet. Maybe this health scare will change her mind, Richard said. She needs to be practical about her situation. As they talked, the bell over the diner, door jingled. Frank glanced up and saw Sergeant Pete walk in. Frank tensed slightly. Pete was not just his supervisor, but also the biggest gossip on the force. Pete spotted Frank right away and started walking toward their booth. Then he recognized Catherine, and his eyes grew wide with surprise. "Evening, Pete," Frank said, trying to sound casual. "Just having some dinner." Pete looked from Frank to Catherine and back again. "Officer Miller," he said formally. "I see you have company." Catherine smiled politely. "Good evening, Sergeant. I'm Catherine Powell. This is my brother, Richard. Officer Miller has been kind enough to show us around town." Pete seemed at a loss for words. "Madam Secretary, we had no idea you were visiting Mapleton." "It's a personal visit," Catherine explained. "My mother is in the hospital." "I'm sorry to hear that," Pete said. "Is there anything the department can do to assist you during your stay?" Catherine glanced at Frank. "Officer Miller has been very helpful already, but thank you for the offer." Pete nodded, still looking stunned. "Of course, well, I won't interrupt your meal any longer. Good evening." He backed away, then turned and practically ran to the counter where he immediately began whispering to Dottie. "I think the secret is out," Richard said with a sigh. Frank watched as Dottie shook her head firmly at whatever Pete was saying. "Dottie won't spread it around, but Pete..." He shrugged. "By tomorrow morning, everyone in town will know." Catherine didn't seem bothered. "It's fine. We couldn't keep it secret forever. I just wanted a quiet arrival for Mom's sake." They finished their meal as Pete kept stealing glances at their booth. When they were done, Frank insisted on paying the bill. "Please," he said when Richard tried to object. "Let me do this for Mrs. Grayson's family." Outside, the night had grown cooler. Stars filled the sky above the small town, far more visible here than in the big cities where Catherine and Richard lived. "Where are you staying tonight?" Frank asked. "We haven't figured that out yet," Richard admitted. "We came straight to the hospital from the airport. The Mapleton Inn is nice," Frank suggested. "It's small but clean." Catherine looked thoughtful. "Actually, I was thinking of staying at Mom's house. It's empty and someone should check on things there anyway." Frank nodded. "That makes sense. Do you need a ride?" "I'm off duty now, but I'd be happy to drive you." "We have the rental car," Richard said, pointing to the SUV parked near the diner. "But we could use directions." "I'll lead you there," Frank offered. "I passed by Mrs. Grayson's street on my way home anyway." As they walked back to their vehicles, Catherine touched Frank's arm lightly. "Thank you for everything today, Officer Miller. Meeting you has been a bright spot in a difficult time." Frank felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride that he had been able to help. Sadness about Mrs. Grayson's condition, and something else he couldn't quite name, a feeling that this day had changed something important in his life. "I'm glad I could help," he said simply. "Mrs. Grayson deserves the best." They got into their cars, and Frank led the way through the quiet streets of Mapleton. As he drove, he thought about how life works in mysterious ways. The troubled boy who had needed a teacher's guidance had grown up to help that teacher's children in their time of need. The circle was complete, Frank thought. But somehow, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, Frank woke up early. He had not slept well. His mind kept going back to Mrs. Grayson in the hospital bed, looking so small and fragile. He thought about Catherine and Richard staying at their mother's empty house. And he thought about Sergeant Pete, who had seen the Secretary of State in Dottie's diner. Frank made coffee and checked his phone. There were 3 missed calls from Pete and a text message that read, "Call me ASAP. Is it really her?" Frank ignored the messages. He would deal with Pete later. Frank had the day off, but he decided to go to the hospital anyway. He wanted to check on Mrs. Grayson and see if her children needed any help. He showered, dressed in casual clothes instead of his uniform, and drove to Mapleton Memorial. The hospital seemed busier than the night before. Frank noticed a news van parked near the main entrance, so the word had spread, just as he had expected. He parked his car at the back of the lot and used the side entrance again. At the nurse's station, Ellen was just ending her night shift. She looked tired but smiled when she saw Frank. "Morning, Frank," she said. "Here to see Mrs. Grayson again?" Frank nodded. How is she doing today? Better, Ellen said. Her vitals are stable and she was asking for breakfast earlier. The doctor is pleased with her progress. That's good news, Frank said, relieved. Are her children here yet? Ellen shook her head. Not yet. But there are 2 men in suits who came about an hour ago. They said they're with the secretary's security team. They've been checking the entire floor. Frank wasn't surprised. Catherine couldn't travel without security for long. They must have arrived from Washington overnight. Is it okay if I go see Mrs. Grayson? Frank asked. Of course, Ellen said. She's awake and would probably enjoy the company. Frank took the elevator to the 2nd floor. In the hallway, he saw the 2 men Ellen had mentioned. They wore dark suits and earpieces. One of them stepped forward as Frank approached. Sir, can I help you? The man asked politely but firmly. I'm here to visit Margaret Grayson, Frank explained. I'm a friend of the family. The man looked at Frank carefully. Your name? Frank Miller. I'm a police officer with Mapleton PD. The security agent seemed to relax slightly. He spoke quietly into his wrist microphone, then nodded to Frank. Room 215. Secretary Powell mentioned, you might stop by. Frank was surprised that Catherine had told her security team about him. He thanked the agent and continued to Mrs. Grayson's room. He knocked softly on the door. Come in, called Mrs. Grayson's voice, sounding stronger than it had the night before. Frank opened the door and found Mrs. Grayson sitting up in bed. She had some color in her cheeks today, and her white hair was neatly combed. She was eating toast and reading a book that rested on her lap. Frank Miller, she said with a smile. Twice in 2 days. I must be special. Frank smiled back. You are special, Mrs. Grayson. How are you feeling today? Much better, she said. The doctors say I'm recovering well. Apparently I'm too stubborn to let a stroke keep me down for long. Frank laughed. That sounded like the Mrs. Grayson he remembered. She had always been tough and determined. Have you seen Catherine and Richard this morning? Frank asked, sitting in the chair next to the bed. Not yet, Mrs. Grayson said. They called earlier. They're cleaning up the house a bit. Apparently I'm not the best housekeeper these days. She smiled, but Frank could see a hint of worry in her eyes. They're concerned about you, Frank said, gently. Living alone after something like this? Mrs. Grayson sighed. I know. They want me to consider moving to that retirement place, Cedar Grove. It's a nice facility, Frank said. My mother has friends there who love it. I'm sure it is, Mrs. Grayson agreed. But that house has been my home for 40 years, Frank. It's where I raised my children. It's where my husband and I built our life together before he passed. Frank understood. Homes held memories that were hard to leave behind. Maybe you could just have someone check on you regularly, he suggested. A home health aide or something. Mrs. Grayson considered this. Perhaps. We'll see what the doctors say. They chatted for a while about town news and old memories. Mrs. Grayson asked about some of her former students, and Frank told her what he knew. Some had moved away, but many had stayed in Mapleton, raising families of their own. After about 30 minutes, there was another knock on the door. Catherine and Richard entered, both looking more rested than they had the day before. Officer Miller, Catherine said, seeming pleased to see him. You beat us here. I wanted to check on your mother, Frank explained, standing up. I should let you have family time now. No need to rush off, Richard said. We brought coffee for everyone. He held up a tray with 4 cups from the local coffee shop. They all sat around Mrs. Grayson's bed, drinking coffee and talking. It felt strangely comfortable, as if they had known each other for years instead of just a day. Frank learned that Richard was a corporate lawyer in Chicago, and that Catherine had grown up wanting to be a teacher like her mother before politics called to her. Mom was disappointed when I didn't go into education, Catherine admitted. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. Not disappointed, just surprised, but then you always did want to change the world on a bigger scale. The conversation was interrupted when one of the security agents knocked and entered the room. Madam Secretary, there's a situation downstairs. The press has gathered outside the hospital. Someone leaked information about your mother's condition. Catherine's face hardened. How many? About a dozen reporters so far, the agent reported. Local news and a few national outlets. They're asking for a statement. Richard looked angry. How did they find out so quickly? Frank thought about Sergeant Pete at the diner the night before. The news had probably spread from there. Small towns had fast gossip networks. I should go talk to them, Catherine said with a sigh. Otherwise, they'll just keep gathering and it will disturb the whole hospital. I'll come with you, Richard offered. Mrs. Grayson looked upset. I'm sorry to cause all this trouble, dear. You came here to help me, not to deal with reporters. Catherine took her mother's hand. It's not your fault, Mom. This is part of my job. Frank stood up. I can help. I know this hospital better than your security team does. There's a conference room on the first floor that the hospital uses for press briefings. You could use that instead of standing outside. Catherine looked grateful. That would be better. Thank you, Officer Miller. Call me Frank, please, he said. I'm not on duty today. Frank led Catherine, Richard, and the security agents to the elevator. As they rode down, he could see the tension in Catherine's face. She had come to Mapleton to be a daughter, not the Secretary of State. Now her private life and public role were colliding. I'll speak to the hospital administrator, Frank said as they reached the first floor. She's a friend. She'll help arrange the conference room. You seem to know everyone in this town, Richard commented. Frank smiled. It's a small place. Everyone knows everyone. The hospital lobby was crowded with reporters and camera crews. They hadn't noticed the group yet as they were gathered near the main entrance. This way, Frank said, leading them down a side hallway toward the administrator's office. The hospital administrator, Dr. Susan Lewis, was surprised to see the Secretary of State appear in her doorway, but quickly agreed to help. Within 15 minutes, the conference room was prepared and the press was invited in. Frank watched from the back of the room as Catherine made a brief statement. She thanked the people of Mapleton for their concern about her mother, explained that Mrs. Grayson was recovering well, and asked for privacy during this family time. She took no questions and left the room quickly. As the reporters filed out, many looking disappointed at the short briefing, Frank approached Catherine and Richard in the hallway. That should satisfy them for now, Catherine said, looking tired. Again, you handled it perfectly, Frank assured her. Short and sweet. Catherine checked her watch. I need to make some calls. There are matters I have to deal with, even from here. You can use my office, Dr. Lewis offered. It's private and has everything you need. Catherine thanked her and left with one of her security agents. Richard turned to Frank. This isn't how we plan to spend our time here, he said. But I guess we should have expected it. Frank nodded. It's hard to keep secrets in Mapleton, especially big ones. Richard looked at Frank thoughtfully. You know, my sister doesn't usually trust people so quickly, but she seems to trust you. Frank wasn't sure how to respond to that. Mrs. Grayson raised good judges of character, he said finally. Richard smiled. Yes, she did. He paused. Frank, would you mind staying with Mom for a while? I need to help. Catherine with some calls and I don't want Mom to be alone with all this commotion. I'd be happy to, Frank said. He had nowhere else to be, and the thought of keeping Mrs. Grayson company appealed to him. As Frank headed back to the elevator, he realized that his ordinary life had been completely disrupted in less than 24 hours. And strangely, he didn't mind at all. 3 days passed quickly. Mrs. Grayson continued to improve, gaining strength each day. The doctors were pleased with her recovery and started talking about releasing her from the hospital soon. The question of where she would go after discharge became more pressing. Frank visited the hospital each day. Sometimes he brought flowers or books for Mrs. Grayson. Sometimes he brought coffee for Catherine and Richard. He found himself drawn to this family and their situation, feeling a connection that went beyond his childhood memories of Mrs. Grayson as his teacher. On the 4th day after the traffic stop that had changed everything, Frank arrived at the hospital to find Catherine sitting alone in the waiting area. She looked tired but smiled when she saw him. Good morning, Frank, she said. Mom's having some tests done. Richard went to get breakfast. Frank sat down beside her. How are you holding up? Catherine sighed. It's been a strange few days. Balancing my work with being here for Mom. The press has mostly left us alone after that statement, thankfully. And have you decided what happens next? When your mother leaves the hospital? Catherine nodded. We've been talking about that a lot. Mom finally agreed that living alone isn't the best idea right now. But she doesn't want to leave Mapleton. That's understandable, Frank said. This has been her home for so long. We've been looking at options, Catherine continued. Cedar Grove has a waiting list, and Richard and I both live too far away to have her move in with either of us. Frank thought, for a moment. There are some good home health services in town. Maybe she could stay in her house with regular visits from a nurse. That's one option we're considering, Catherine agreed. But someone would need to check on her regularly, not just a visiting nurse. Frank hesitated, then said, I could help with that. I drive by her street every day on patrol. I could stop in, make sure she's okay. Catherine looked at him with surprise and gratitude. You would do that? Of course, Frank said simply. Mrs. Grayson did so much for me. It would be an honor to help her now. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Frank noticed how Catherine seemed different here in Mapleton than she did on television. More relaxed, more human. The stress never fully left her face, but here she was, just a daughter worried about her mother. Not a powerful government official, Frank, Catherine said suddenly. Have you ever thought about doing more with your career? Beyond Mapleton PD? The question caught Frank off guard. Not really, I love this town. I know everyone here. You're good at what you do, Catherine observed. The way you handled the situation with the press, how you've helped us navigate everything here. Those are valuable skills. Frank wasn't sure where she was going with this. Thank you, but I'm just a small-town cop. A small-town cop who's shown remarkable judgment and discretion, Catherine said. Those qualities are rare and important. Before she could say more, Richard appeared with a tray of coffee cups. Good morning, Frank. Join us for coffee. Frank accepted a cup gratefully. The hospital coffee was terrible, and Richard had brought the good stuff from the cafe downtown. The doctor just called me, Richard said to Catherine. Mom's tests look good. They're talking about releasing her tomorrow. That's wonderful news, Catherine said. Did they say anything about restrictions or care requirements? She'll need physical therapy twice a week, and someone should stay with her for at least the first few weeks, Richard explained. I've extended my leave from the firm for another week, but after that, the unspoken problem hung in the air. After Richard left, who would look after Mrs. Grayson? I have an idea, Frank said slowly. My mother lives just 2 streets over from Mrs. Grayson. She's been talking about wanting company. Maybe she could stay with your mother for a while, at least until a spot opens at Cedar Grove or you find another solution. Catherine and Richard exchanged looks. Would your mother be willing to do that? Catherine asked. I think she'd love it, Frank said. She and Mrs. Grayson were in the same garden club years ago, and Mom has been lonely since my father passed. It might be good for both of them. That could work, Richard said thoughtfully. It would give us more time to figure out a long-term plan. They were interrupted by a nurse who came to tell them that Mrs. Grayson was back in her room. Together they went to see her. She looked tired from the tests, but brightened when she saw them all. My favorite people altogether, she said. What a treat. They told her about the possible arrangement with Frank's mother. To their relief, Mrs. Grayson seemed to like the idea. Betty Miller? Oh, we had such fun in the garden club, Mrs. Grayson said. She grows the most beautiful roses, and she always did make the best lemon cake in town. It was settled. Frank called his mother, who was delighted by the suggestion. She immediately began talking about cleaning the guest room and making fresh curtains. Later that afternoon, Frank left the hospital to go pick up his mother so she could visit Mrs. Grayson and discuss the details of their arrangement. As he walked to his car, Catherine followed him out. Frank, wait, she called. I wanted to talk to you about something. Frank stopped and turned. What is it? I meant what I said earlier, Catherine said. About your skills and judgment. I've been watching how you handle situations, how people in this town respect you, how you care about people. Frank wasn't sure where this was going. Thank you, but I have a proposal for you, Catherine continued. The Department of State has a liaison office that works with law enforcement agencies. They're looking for someone with your background and skills. Someone who understands both security concerns and the human element. Frank stared at her in shock. Are you offering me a job? Catherine smiled. I'm suggesting you consider applying for one. It would mean moving to Washington, of course, but it would also mean doing important work on a larger scale. Frank's mind raced. Leave Mapleton? Move to Washington? Work for the State Department? It was so far from anything he had ever considered. I don't know what to say, he admitted. This is unexpected. You don't need to decide now, Catherine said. Think about it. Talk to your mother. The position won't be filled for another month. She handed him a business card with her private number written on the back. Call me when you've had time to consider it. Whatever you decide, I'm grateful for everything you've done for my family. Frank took the card, still feeling stunned. I will think about it. Thank you for the opportunity. As Catherine walked back into the hospital, Frank stood in the parking lot looking at the card in his hand. 4 days ago, he had been a small-town police officer doing a routine traffic stop. Now the Secretary of State was suggesting he apply for a position in Washington. Life could change in an instant, Frank thought. Sometimes all it took was noticing who was in the back seat of a car. He drove to his mother's house, thinking about Mrs. Grayson, about Catherine's offer, about the future. He didn't know what he would decide yet. Washington was a long way from Mapleton, but then again, maybe it was time for a new chapter in his life. As he pulled into his mother's driveway, Frank smiled to himself. Mrs. Grayson had changed his life when he was 9 years old, steering him toward becoming a police officer instead of a troublemaker. Now, all these years later, her daughter might be changing his life again. Some people just had a way of pointing you in the right direction, Frank thought. And sometimes, the most important journeys began with a simple traffic stop. When he told his mother about Catherine's job offer, she wasn't surprised at all. Margaret always said you were destined for big things, Frank, his mother said, as she put on her coat, ready to go visit her old friend in the hospital. Maybe it's time you found out just how big. Frank looked out the window at the small town he had known all his life. Whatever he decided, he knew one thing for certain. Pulling over that black SUV had been the beginning of something important, not just for Mrs. Grayson and her family, but for him too. Sometimes being a cop meant giving tickets and enforcing laws. But sometimes, just sometimes, it meant finding connections that changed everything.